The night they handed her over, they believed she would break. But they had no idea who they were giving her to. The room was built for transactions, not the kind that involved money alone, but the kind that carried weight far beyond numbers. Deals made in spaces like this did not end with signatures. They ended with consequences. Everything about the environment reflected that. Low lighting, controlled silence, measured presence. No wasted movement. No unnecessary words. Because in rooms like this, power did not need to be announced. It was understood. The intellectual hook settled into the moment with cold precision. The most dangerous deals are not the ones where something is sold, but the ones where someone is. Evelyn Cross stood in the center of that truth. She wasn't restrained. No chains held her in place. No visible force pushed her forward. And yet, there was no freedom in her position. Because freedom is not defined by movement. It is defined by choice. And she had none. The people surrounding her had already made the decision. Men who did not hesitate. Men who did not question. Men who did not see individuals. Only outcomes. To them, Evelyn was not a person. She was a solution, a way to settle something that had grown too large to control. A debt, a balance, a problem that required something valuable to fix it. And in their world, value was not always measured in money. Sometimes it was measured in people. Evelyn understood that completely, not because they explained it, but because she had been part of this world long enough to recognize how it worked. Nothing was random. Nothing was emotional. Everything was calculated, even betrayal, especially betrayal. That was what made it real. Not the fact that she had been given away, but the way it had been decided long before she entered the room. There had been no discussion for her, no negotiation, no hesitation. Her fate had been sealed in absence, and her presence now was just a formality, a final step in a process that had already reached its conclusion. She did not react, did not break, did not allow anything to show on the surface, because emotions in a moment like this are not protection. They are exposure, and exposure is weakness. So she remained still, controlled, composed in a way that did not match the situation. That was the first thing they misunderstood, because people who break are easy to define, easy to dismiss, but people who don't are harder to predict, and unpredictability is dangerous. Even if they didn't realize it yet, the voices around her were calm, detached, focused on outcome rather than consequence. They spoke about her without acknowledging her, as if she were already gone, as if her existence had already been reduced to something transactional, because to them, it had. Evelyn did not look at them, not directly, because there was nothing left to see, no recognition, no hesitation, no sign that this decision could be changed, only certainty. And certainty, when it removes your value completely, is worse than fear, because fear leaves room for possibility, but certainty ends it. The agreement was finalized quickly, as all things are in a world where hesitation is seen as weakness. The terms had already been set, the outcome already decided. Evelyn was part of the exchange, a controlled transfer, a calculated solution. Nothing more, nothing less. The power imbalance in the room was absolute. She stood alone, while they sat in control, making decisions that would determine her future, without ever needing to acknowledge her as part of it. That was how their world worked. Power did not require permission. It required position, and she had none. But there was something else in the room, something that did not fully align with the rest. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Evelyn felt it before she identified it. The shift in awareness, the difference in attention, subtle, almost invisible, but enough, because when everything is controlled, even the smallest difference stands out. Her gaze moved, carefully, without drawing attention, and that was when she saw him, Adrian Wolfe. He was not positioned at the center. He didn't need to be, because men like him did not rely on position to define their authority. They defined the space simply by being in it. He was still, completely, no movement, no reaction, no visible involvement in the decision being made. But his presence was heavier than anyone else's in the room. not because he demanded attention, but because attention naturally moved toward him. His reputation had already reached her long before this moment, not through stories, but through understanding. Men like Adrian Wolfe were not explained. They were known, controlled, ruthless, unpredictable in a way that did not come from chaos, but from precision. He didn't break people physically. He broke them mentally, slowly, completely, until there was nothing left to resist. That was what made him dangerous. Not what he did, but how he did it. And now, she was being given to him. The realization settled into her with quiet clarity, not fear, not panic, but understanding. Because if anyone could break her, it would be him. But something didn't align, not in the decision, but in him. Because while everyone else in the room had already moved on, already accepted the outcome, already reduced her to nothing, he hadn't. He was watching, not the room, not the men, her. And that was different because he wasn't looking at her the way the others were. He wasn't dismissing her, wasn't reducing her, wasn't treating her as something already decided. He was studying her, as if she was something that did not fully match the role she had been given. And that changed everything. Evelyn held his gaze for only a moment. That was all it took. Because in that moment, she saw something unexpected, not indifference, not agreement, but recognition, not of who she was, but of something deeper, something that had not yet been defined, something that had not yet been decided. The transfer began. Movement replaced stillness. Control shifted from one side of the room to the other. The decision, once abstract, became real. Evelyn stepped forward when required, not forced, not guided, but because she understood there was no alternative. But as she moved, her awareness sharpened, because that presence, that difference, had not disappeared. It had remained, watching. And as she reached the point where the decision became irreversible, she allowed herself one final realization, clear, precise, unavoidable. He wasn't seeing her the way the others had. He wasn't looking at her as something already broken, as something already defined, as something already lost. He was looking at her as something he had not yet understood, and that was far more dangerous. As the moment settled into its final form, one last truth emerged, quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. He's not looking at her like something to break, but like something to understand. He didn't just control people, he destroyed them, and she was supposed to be next. By the time Evelyn Cross realized Adrian Wolfe had not looked at her like something already broken, the situation had already shifted into something far more dangerous. Because being handed over to a man like him did not create uncertainty. It created inevitability. Everyone in that world understood what happened to people who ended up under his control. They didn't leave the same, if they left at all. The intellectual hook settled into the tension with quiet precision. Some men don't destroy people through force. They destroy them by understanding exactly where they are weakest. That was what Adrian Wolfe was known for. Not violence, not chaos, but precision, psychological, calculated, absolute. His reputation had never needed explanation. It existed in absence, in the silence of those who had once stood against him, in the way his name was not spoken lightly, in the way even powerful men adjusted their decisions when he was involved. Because Adrian Wolfe did not react. He dismantled, slowly, deliberately, without leaving anything behind. And now, Evelyn had been placed directly in his world, not as a guest, not as an ally, but as something far more vulnerable, a subject, something to be tested, to be broken, to be controlled. That was her role. That was what everyone expected. That was what he was supposed to do. The environment she was brought into reflected him perfectly, not excessive, not aggressive, but controlled in a way that made everything feel intentional. Nothing out of place, nothing unnecessary, everything structured, everything quiet, everything precise. The kind of place where nothing happened without purpose, and purpose always led back to him. Evelyn felt it immediately, the shift from being part of a transaction to being inside a system, because this was not a temporary space. This was his world, and his world did not operate on chance. It operated on control, complete, unquestionable. She was not restrained, not locked away, not treated like something that needed to be forced into submission. And that alone was unsettling, because force creates resistance, but absence of force creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is harder to fight. Her first interaction with him did not come through words. It came through presence. He did not announce himself, did not create a moment, did not shift the environment in a way that demanded attention, because he didn't need to. Attention moved toward him naturally, without effort, without instruction, because power like his does not need to be proven. It exists, and when he entered the space, nothing changed, because everything had already been designed to accommodate him. Evelyn noticed him immediately, not because he stood out, but because everything around him aligned. The silence adjusted, the structure tightened, the space became more defined, because his presence was control, absolute. He did not approach her directly, did not initiate interaction, did not attempt to establish dominance, because dominance for him was not something he needed to assert. It was already understood. Instead, he observed, cold, unreadable, precise. His gaze did not carry emotion, did not carry judgment, did not carry anything that could be easily defined. It carried analysis, as if she were something he had not yet categorized. And that was unexpected, because men like Adrian Wolfe did not leave things undefined. Everything in his world had a place. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a conclusion. And yet, she had none. Not yet. Evelyn remained still, not submissive, not reactive, but controlled, because she understood something important. The moment you react in front of someone like him, you give them information. And information is what he used to break people. So she gave him nothing. No fear, no resistance, no weakness. And that created a problem, because without weakness, there was nothing to exploit. Without reaction, there was nothing to analyze. Without vulnerability, there was nothing to break. That was the first disruption. Small, but significant, because Adrian Wolfe did not operate without data, and she was giving him none. The silence between them was not empty. It was active, filled with observation, with calculation, with something unspoken that neither of them acknowledged, but both understood. He was studying her, not as a person, not as a threat, but as something that did not match expectations, and that held his attention longer than it should have, longer than necessary, longer than logical. That was the second disruption, because his attention did not linger without reason, and if it was lingering, then something had changed. Evelyn felt it, not emotionally, not instinctively, but through awareness. The slight delay in his observation, the subtle pause before his focus shifted, the way he did not move on from her as quickly as he should have. These were not dramatic changes, but they were enough to confirm what she already suspected. He was not treating her like the others. Not yet, and that was dangerous, because clarity creates predictability, but unpredictability creates risk. His role was simple: break her, dismantle her control, expose her weakness, reduce her to something manageable, something usable. That was what he did. That was what he was known for. That was what he was expected to do. But he didn't. Not immediately. Not at all. Instead, he waited, and that was the third disruption. Because waiting for a man like him was not hesitation. It was intention. But the intention was unclear, even to those who knew him best. The system around him did not question him. It never did, but it adjusted, because his lack of action was action in itself. The absence of movement created tension. The delay created uncertainty. And uncertainty was not something his world was built to handle. Evelyn understood it, not through explanation, but through observation. The way the environment responded, the way nothing moved forward, the way everything seemed to pause, without stopping, because without his decision, nothing was complete, and he had not decided. Not yet. That was what made it dangerous. Not what he would do, But what he hadn't done, because the expected outcome had not happened, and when expectations are broken, something new begins, as the silence between them deepened into something sharper, more focused, and far more dangerous. One final truth settled into place. He was supposed to break her, but instead, he waits and no one understands why in his world. Only the strong survived, but she refused to show weakness. By the time it became clear that Adrian Wolfe was not going to break Evelyn Cross immediately, the nature of her situation had already changed, not into safety, but into something far more complex. Because immediate destruction is predictable, delayed intention is not. The intellectual hook settled into her awareness with quiet precision. The most dangerous environments are not the ones that force you to break, but the ones that wait to see how long you can resist. That was the world she had entered. Adrian Wolfe's empire did not operate on visible force. It operated on structure. Everything was controlled, not in a way that felt restrictive, but in a way that removed uncertainty. People moved with purpose. Decisions were executed without hesitation. There were no visible cracks, no chaos, no disorder, because chaos creates opportunity. And in his world, opportunity belonged only to him. Evelyn understood that quickly, not because anyone explained it, but because it was impossible not to feel. The environment itself carried weight, not physical pressure, but psychological, the kind that settles into awareness and stays there, constant, unavoidable, unforgiving. Her position within that world remained undefined. She was not imprisoned. There were no locks, no visible barriers, no force restricting her movement. But she was not free either. There were boundaries, invisible ones, felt, not seen, understood, not explained, limits she could not cross, even if no one told her where they were. And that was intentional, because visible control invites resistance. But invisible control creates compliance, not through fear, but through awareness. Evelyn moved carefully, not cautiously, but deliberately, because every movement mattered. Every action carried meaning. Every decision had consequence. And she refused to give him what he was waiting for. Weakness. That was what this world demanded, not physically, but psychologically. It tested people, not through force, but through pressure, constant, subtle, relentless. It observed how they reacted, how they adapted, how long they could hold themselves together before something inside them fractured. And once that fracture appeared, that was when Adrian Wolfe acted. That was how he broke people, not by creating weakness, but by waiting for it to reveal itself. Evelyn understood that, and that understanding shaped everything she did. She did not resist outwardly, did not challenge the system, did not push against the structure around her, because resistance in a place like this is predictable, and predictable behavior is easy to control. Instead, she adapted, calm, controlled, measured in a way that made her presence almost seamless within the system. But internally, she resisted completely. Her fear did not disappear, but it changed. It no longer controlled her actions. It informed them, sharpened them, refined them, because fear, when controlled, becomes awareness. And awareness is a first step toward survival. The tension between fear and resistance settled into something steady, balanced, not overwhelming, not consuming, but constant, because every moment in this world required control, and control requires effort. Adrian's behavior remained consistent on the surface. He did not approach her directly, did not confront her, did not attempt to force a reaction, because he didn't need to. The system around him did that for him. Every structure, every interaction, every moment of silence was part of the process, a process designed to expose weakness. But Evelyn did not give him that, not easily, and that changed the dynamic. He continued to observe her, closely, more closely than before, but his observation had shifted. It was no longer just analysis. It carried something else, something deeper, something more focused, as if he was no longer just waiting for her to break, but trying to understand why she hadn't. And that was new, because men like Adrian Wolfe did not question outcomes. They created them. But now, he was observing something that did not align with his expectations, something that did not follow the pattern he had seen countless times before. And that deviation held his attention. The contrast between them became more defined with each passing moment. Evelyn resisted, silently, internally, without giving him anything he could use. Adrian studied, carefully, precisely, without revealing what he was looking for. Neither of them acknowledged it, but the tension was there, constant, unspoken, unavoidable, because now this was no longer a simple dynamic, not controller and subject, not power and submission, but something else, something undefined, something shifting, something neither of them had fully named, but both understood. The environment around them remained unchanged, structured, controlled, stable, but within that stability, something had begun to move, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The system was still his, completely, but she was no longer just part of it. She was affecting it, not through action, but through presence, through resistance, through the simple fact that she had not broken when she was expected to, and that created imbalance. Small, subtle, but real, because the systems like his rely on predictability, and she was no longer predictable. Adrian recognized it, even if he did not show it, even if he did not act on it, because recognition for him was not something expressed. It was something processed, stored, analyzed, until it reached a conclusion. But that conclusion had not come yet, not fully, because she had not given him enough. And that was the problem. Evelyn realized something in that moment. Clear, sharp, unavoidable. He wasn't approaching her the way he approached others. He wasn't applying pressure, wasn't forcing reaction, wasn't accelerating the process. He was doing something else, something far more controlled, far more intentional. He was waiting, but not for her to break, for something else, something she had not yet understood, and that was far more dangerous, because breaking someone is simple, understanding them is not. And if Adrian Wolfe was choosing to understand her instead of breaking her, then this was no longer about control. It was about something deeper, something more complex, something far more unpredictable. As the realization settled into her completely, one final truth emerged, quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. He's not trying to break her the way he breaks others, and that's more dangerous. She wasn't chosen to be broken. She was chosen because she was already stronger than they knew. By the time Evelyn Cross realized Adrian Wolfe was not trying to break her the way he broke others, the question had already begun to shift. It was no longer about survival. It was about purpose. Because survival explains the present, but purpose explains everything else. The intellectual hook settled into her awareness with cold clarity. The most dangerous realization is not that you were chosen, but that you were chosen long before you ever knew it. That was the truth waiting beneath everything, and it was beginning to surface. Evelyn had spent enough time inside Adrian's world to understand one thing clearly. Nothing here was accidental. Every movement, every decision, every outcome, it all followed structure. It all followed intention, which meant one thing. Her presence was not random, not a last-minute solution, not a convenient exchange. It had been decided before she ever stepped into that room, before she ever became part of the deal, before she even understood that something had been moving beneath her life, without her awareness. That realization did not come as a shock. It came as a pattern, slowly forming, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. The first shift appeared in something small, a fragment of information, not given to her directly, not meant for her, but seen, observed, stored, because Evelyn had learned something important. Information in this world does not need to be offered. It needs to be noticed. And she noticed everything. Names, connections, references that seemed distant, but felt familiar. Not enough to form a complete picture, but enough to create disruption. Because familiarity in a place like this means history. And history means connection. Evelyn did not react. She did not allow curiosity to turn into exposure, because curiosity, when visible, becomes vulnerability. Instead, she processed it internally, carefully, quietly, with the same control she had maintained since the moment she arrived. Her past had always been simple, defined, contained within clear boundaries. Or at least, that was what she believed. Now, those boundaries began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to introduce doubt, enough to create cracks in certainties she had always relied on. Because once doubt exists, truth begins to follow. She began to look back, not emotionally, not nostalgically, but analytically. Moments that had once seemed insignificant now carried weight. Decisions that had felt ordinary now felt directed. Absences that had gone unnoticed now felt intentional. Her past was no longer a series of events. It was a structure, one that had been built around her, quietly, carefully, without her ever realizing it. And that changed everything. Because if her past had been structured, then her present was not coincidence. It was continuation. The connection became clearer, not fully revealed, but undeniable. There were names tied to Adrian's world that aligned with fragments of her own, not directly, not obviously, but enough to establish something deeper, something hidden, something that had existed long before either of them stood in the same space. And that realization was more dangerous than fear, because fear can be controlled. But truth rewrites everything. Evelyn's emotional state shifted, not into panic, not into confusion, but into awareness, because confusion, when controlled, becomes clarity, and clarity creates power. Even in a situation where power does not belong to you, she was not chosen because she was weak. That part became clear, because weakness would have made this simple, predictable, easily resolved. But nothing about this was simple. Nothing about this was predictable, which meant she had been chosen for a reason that extended beyond the deal, beyond the exchange, beyond the moment she had been handed over. She was part of something larger, something that had been moving long before she understood it, something that connected her to Adrian Wolfe, not directly, but structurally, through history, through conflict, through something that had not yet been fully revealed. And that was what made this dangerous, because now she was no longer just inside his world. She was part of the reason it existed the way it did. That realization changed how she saw him, not as just a man who controlled her situation, but as someone connected to something she had never fully understood, something tied to her past, something that had shaped both of their paths, without either of them acknowledging it. Until now, Adrian's behavior began to make more sense. Not completely, but enough. His hesitation, his observation, the way he had not followed the expected outcome. It was not uncertainty. It was recognition. He had seen something. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know she was not what she appeared to be. Enough to understand that breaking her would not achieve what others expected. Enough to delay, to observe, to reconsider. Because he understood something she was only beginning to realize. She was not random. And if she was not random, then she had value. Not as a person, not emotionally, but structurally, within the system, within the conflict, within something much larger than either of them. The truth continued to unfold, slowly, relentlessly, until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Her life had not been simple. It had been simplified. Her identity had not been clear. It had been controlled. And her presence here was not a coincidence. It was a result, a final step in something that had been set in motion long before she had any awareness of it. As that realization settled into its final form, one last truth emerged, sharp, cold, and impossible to ignore. This was never a last-minute decision. It had been planned long before she was ever given to him. The moment she didn't break, she became something he couldn't control. By the time Evelyn Cross understood that her presence in Adrian Wolfe's world had been planned long before she ever arrived, something inside her had already changed. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone could easily see, but internally, completely. Because once a person realizes they were never random, fear begins to lose its grip. The intellectual hook settled into her awareness with quiet force. The moment someone stops reacting to pressure, they stop being something you can control. That was the moment everything shifted. Evelyn no longer moved through his world as someone waiting for something to happen to her. She moved as someone who understood something already had. And that understanding changed her behavior, not dramatically, not in a way that invited attention, but precisely, carefully. Every action became intentional, every movement calculated, every response controlled. She stopped reacting, not because there was nothing to react to, but because reaction was no longer useful, because reaction creates patterns, and patterns can be broken, but unpredictability cannot. Her transformation was subtle, but undeniable. The tension that had once lived beneath her stillness, the quiet awareness of danger, the constant readiness to survive, began to evolve, not disappear, but refine. It became sharper, more focused, less emotional, more strategic. She no longer viewed the environment as something to endure. She viewed it as something to understand, to navigate, to exist within, without losing herself to it. And that difference was everything. Adrian's world did not change. It remained structured, controlled, unshaken. But within that structure, her position began to shift, not physically, not visibly, but psychologically. She was no longer just part of the system. She was moving within it, with awareness, with intention. And intention is where control begins to change. Adrian noticed, not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably, because men like him do not miss changes, especially not ones that disrupt patterns. His attention toward her increased, not in frequency, but in depth. He watched her more closely now, not as something waiting to break, but as something that had not broken. And that distinction was critical, because everything he knew about control relied on that moment. The moment when pressure reveals weakness, the moment when resistance fractures, the moment when a person becomes predictable. But Evelyn had not reached that moment. She had moved past it, and now there was nothing for him to exploit. No visible weakness, no emotional reaction, no clear point of pressure. And that created a problem, not for her, for him, because control without information becomes uncertainty. And uncertainty is something his world was not built to handle. The tension between them grew, not loudly, not visibly, but constantly, because now there was awareness on both sides. She knew he was observing her. He knew she was no longer reacting, and neither of them acknowledged it, because acknowledgement creates clarity, and clarity limits advantage. So the silence remained, heavy, deliberate, filled with meaning neither of them needed to express. Her calmness was not passive. It was controlled, deliberate, strategic in a way that made her presence difficult to define, because she did not challenge him, did not resist him outwardly, did not disrupt the system he had built, but she did not submit to it either. She existed within it, without becoming part of it. And that was rare, because most people, when placed in a system like his, become defined by it. They adapt, they react, they reveal themselves. But Evelyn did none of those things. She remained undefined, and undefined things are dangerous. Adrian understood that, even if he did not show it, even if he did not act on it, because his behavior did not change externally. He remained controlled, distant, operating within the same structure that had always defined him. But internally, something had shifted. His observation had changed. It was no longer just about identifying weakness. It was about understanding resistance, understanding her. And understanding is far more complex than breaking, because breaking is simple. It follows a process, a pattern, a predictable outcome. But understanding requires patience, requires attention, requires something he had never needed before, time, and he was giving it. That was what made this different. That was what made this dangerous, Because the moment someone like Adrian Wolfe chooses to understand instead of destroy, everything changes. The power shift did not happen all at once. It was not obvious, not dramatic, but it was real. It began in the smallest difference. Her lack of fear, not absence, but control. Because fear was still there. It had to be. But it no longer dictated her actions. It no longer defined her behavior. It no longer gave him anything to use. And that was where control began to slip, not from his hands, but from the structure he relied on, because his methods required reaction, required vulnerability, required weakness, and she was giving him none. For the first time, there was uncertainty, not in his power, but in his process, and that was something he had never faced before. Evelyn felt it clearly now, not as strength, not as dominance, but as awareness. The awareness that she was no longer predictable, no longer easily defined, no longer something that could be broken, using the same methods he had always relied on. And that awareness was power, not absolute, not external, but internal. And internal power is the most difficult to take away. As the silence between them deepened into something sharper, more focused, and far more dangerous, one final truth settled into place. For the first time, he realizes she's not afraid of him, and that changes everything. He was meant to destroy her, but instead, she became the one thing he couldn't ignore. By the time Adrian Wolfe realized Evelyn Cross was no longer afraid of him, the shift had already begun, not in the system, not in the structure he had built, but in him, and that was where everything became dangerous. The intellectual hook settled into the tension with sharp clarity. The most controlled men don't change because they change because something refuses to fit inside control they built. Evelyn did not fit, and that was the problem. Adrian's world had always operated on certainty. Every person had a role. Every outcome had a direction. Every weakness had a solution, and every solution ended the same way, with control. But Evelyn had disrupted that pattern, not through resistance, not through defiance, but through absence, the absence of fear, the absence of reaction, the absence of weakness. And without those things, the system had nothing to act on. At first, it had been curiosity, a deviation from expectation, something to observe, something to understand, because anomalies in his world were not ignored. They were studied, analyzed, broken down until they could be controlled. That was how he had always operated. That was how he had built everything around him. But this time, the process did not follow through, because the more he observed her, the less she aligned with anything he had seen before. Curiosity deepened, not emotionally, not irrationally, but structurally, because understanding something that does not follow pattern requires more attention, more time, more focus. And he gave it. That was the first change. Small, but significant, because Adrian Wolfe did not invest time without purpose. And yet, his attention toward her became more consistent, more deliberate, not in a way that exposed interest, but in a way that made her presence unavoidable. She was no longer just part of the system. She was part of his awareness, constantly, and that was where curiosity began to shift. Because curiosity, when prolonged, becomes something else, something deeper, something more difficult to define, something that does not align with control. Attachment, not emotional in the way most would understand, not soft, not visible, but present, because he no longer observed her as something external. He observed her as something connected to his world, to his decisions, to something he had not yet fully acknowledged. And that was dangerous, because control relies on distance, but connection removes it. The pressure from his world did not disappear. It increased, subtly but undeniably, because Evelyn's presence no longer made sense. She had not been broken, had not been reduced, had not fulfilled the role she had been given, and that created imbalance. The system did not question him. It never did, but it adjusted through expectation, through silence, through the quiet understanding that something needed to be resolved. The message was clear. She needed to be dealt with, broken, or removed, because unresolved variables create risk, and risk is something his world does not tolerate. Adrian understood that better than anyone because he had built that system. He had defined its rules, its limits, its outcomes, and now he was the one disrupting it. The logical decision was simple: complete the process, restore balance, remove the uncertainty. That was what he should have done. That was what he had always done. But this time, he didn't. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. And that choice created conflict, not external, not visible, but internal, because for the first time, logic was no longer enough. The situation did not align, not completely, not precisely, and that lack of alignment was something he could not ignore. His nature was control, absolute, unquestioned, but his actions no longer fully reflected that, because he delayed, repeatedly, without explanation, without justification, without resolution. And delay, in a world like his, is a decision, even if it appears to be the absence of one. Evelyn felt the shift before she understood it, not through words, not through direct action, but through tension. The environment around her changed subtly. The structure tightened, the awareness sharpened, because her presence was no longer neutral. It had become significant, and significance always carries consequence. But Adrian's response did not align with that consequence. He did not increase pressure, did not force confrontation, did not attempt to accelerate the process. Instead, he adjusted, quietly, carefully, without making it visible. He created space, not freedom, but distance, between her and the pressure of his world. Small changes, subtle shifts, decisions that were not obvious, but intentional. And those changes protected her, not directly, not openly, but undeniably. Evelyn recognized it, slowly, carefully, because recognition in a place like this is dangerous, but impossible to avoid. This was no longer about control, no longer about breaking her, no longer about completing the role she had been given, because if it was, he would have done it already. He would not hesitate, would not delay, would not allow this to continue. But he had, which meant one thing. He was no longer acting according to the system. He was acting according to something else, something that did not follow rules, did not follow logic, did not follow anything he had built his world on. And that was what made it dangerous, because men like Adrian Wolfe do not change easily. And when they do, it is never without consequence. As the tension between his nature and his actions deepened into something sharper, more unstable, and far more dangerous, one final realization settled into place. He's no longer trying to break her. He's trying to understand her. The truth didn't just reveal her. It revealed what he'd been hiding from himself. By the time Evelyn Cross realized Adrian Wolfe was no longer trying to break her, the final piece of truth was already beginning to surface, not as a sudden revelation, but as something inevitable. Because some truths are not discovered. They unfold, slowly, relentlessly, until there is no way left to ignore them. The intellectual hook settled into the moment with sharp clarity. The most dangerous truths are not the ones that expose others, but the ones that expose what you've been refusing to see within yourself. That was the truth waiting between them, and it changed everything. The connection Evelyn had sensed, fragmented, incomplete, buried beneath layers of controlled information, now stood fully formed. Clear, undeniable, irreversible. Her past was not just connected to Adrian's world. It was part of his foundation, not as an outsider, not as a coincidence, but as something that had once existed directly against it. Her family had not been distant from power. They had been part of a conflict that had shaped the structure Adrian now controlled, a conflict that had ended, not in resolution, but in disappearance. The kind of disappearance that leaves no trace, except in the people who survived it. Evelyn was one of them, not knowingly, not consciously, but structurally. Her identity had been altered, simplified, reduced to something safe, because the truth beneath it was too dangerous to exist openly. And now, that truth had returned, not as memory, but as reality. Adrian had known, not every detail, not every connection, but enough. Enough to recognize the pattern when it surfaced. Enough to understand what she represented. Enough to stop himself from doing what he had always done. Because breaking her would not just end her, it would destroy something he had not yet fully understood. And that was why he had hesitated. Not because he couldn't act, but because the truth had changed the outcome before he even made a decision. The emotional conflict that followed was not chaotic. It was controlled, sharp, unavoidable, because men like Adrian Wolfe did not lose control. They confronted reality, no matter how complex, no matter how inconvenient. And this reality was both. Evelyn's existence carried two opposing truths. Betrayal, because everything she had believed about herself was incomplete, because her past had been shaped without her consent, because her identity had been controlled. And connection, because that same past tied her directly to him, to his world, to the system he had built, to the conflict that had defined everything around them. Those two truths could not exist without tension, and that tension defined everything between them. The dynamic shifted completely, not gradually, not subtly, but fundamentally. She was no longer the one placed under his control. He was no longer the one defining her position. Those roles no longer existed, because control requires distance, and distance had been removed. Now they stood within the same truth, bound by something neither of them had chosen, but both of them had to face. That understanding created something far more dangerous than power. It created equality, not an authority, not in influence, but in awareness, because now neither of them held the full advantage, and that changed everything. The intensity between them reached its peak, not through confrontation, not through action, but through presence. Every moment carried weight. Every silence held meaning. Every decision had consequence. Adrian did not step back, did not return to the version of himself that had existed before, because that version no longer fit, not within this truth, not within this reality. Because now, this was not just about control, it was about choice. And choice is where power becomes complicated, because power is simple. It follows structure, it follows logic, it follows outcome. But choice does not. Choice exists outside of all of that. And Adrian had already made one. Not fully, not openly, but undeniably. He had chosen not to break her. He had chosen to delay, to observe, to understand. And now he had to choose what came next. Evelyn understood it too, not emotionally, not impulsively, but clearly. The truth had not freed her. It had bound her to him, to his world, to something that could not be undone. Because now, walking away was no longer simple. It was no longer just about leaving. It was about breaking something that had already formed, something that existed whether they acknowledged it or not. And that was far more dangerous than staying. The tension did not resolve. It deepened, because neither of them moved away from it. Neither of them chose distance. Neither of them returned to what existed before, because they couldn't. Not anymore. As the weight of everything settled into its final form, one last truth remained, sharp, heavy, and impossible to escape. Even after everything, neither of them walks away. She was meant to be broken, but she became the reason he changed. By the time the truth settled fully between them, there was nothing left to return to. No version of the past that still existed. No version of themselves that remained untouched. Because once something fundamental shifts, it does not reverse. The intellectual hook settled into silence with quiet finality. The most powerful transformations are not the ones you choose, but the ones you cannot undo once they begin. That was what had happened to both of them. Evelyn Cross was no longer the woman who had been handed over as part of a deal. That version of her had been defined by others, limited by decisions she did not make, placed into a role she did not choose. But that version was gone, not because she escaped, not because she was freed, but because she had understood, Fully, completely, irreversibly. Understanding had changed her, not emotionally, not dramatically, but structurally. She no longer moved through the world as someone reacting to it. She moved as someone aware of its systems, its patterns, its hidden rules, and most importantly, her place within it. She was no longer a victim, not because the situation had changed, but because she had. And that was something no one could take away. Her presence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried control, not over others, but over herself. And self-control is the foundation of every other form of power. Adrian Wolfe saw it, not as a possibility, not as a theory, but as fact. He had watched every stage of it, from resistance to awareness to something far beyond either. And now there was nothing left to break, because there was nothing left that could be reduced. She had become something else, something that did not fit into the systems he had built, something that could not be controlled using the methods he had always relied on, and that changed him, not visibly, not in a way that weakened his authority, but internally, where control had always been absolute, unchallenged, untouched. Now there was something else, something that did not follow rules, did not follow logic, did not follow structure. Obsession, not emotional in the way others would understand, not impulsive, not chaotic, but constant, because Evelyn was no longer just part of his world. She had become something within it, something he could not ignore, something he could not remove, something that existed beyond control. And that was what made it dangerous, because control had always defined him. It had built his empire, maintained his power, protected his position. But now, control was no longer enough, because there was something he could not control. And instead of eliminating it, he allowed it to exist. That was a change. Not that he lost control, but that he chose not to use it. And that choice was irreversible. His world did not adjust easily. It resisted, quietly, subtly, but inevitably, because systems built on absolute control do not accept exceptions. And Evelyn had become one. The imbalance did not collapse everything. Not immediately, but it existed, constant, unavoidable, because now every decision he made carried something it never had before. Consequence beyond power, consequence beyond structure, consequence tied to something personal, something that could not be reduced to logic. And that was where transformation begins. The dynamic between them settled into something final, not safe, not stable, but real, because what existed between them was no longer based on circumstance, or control, or necessity. It was based on something far more dangerous. Choice, his choice, her understanding, and the truth they both carried. Evelyn did not leave, not because she couldn't, but because leaving would not change what had already been created, what had already been understood, what had already become irreversible. And Adrian did not force her to stay, because forcing her would return everything to what it had been. And that version no longer existed. They existed within something undefined, something that did not follow rules, did not offer safety, did not promise stability, but remained unavoidable. Because once two people share a truth that changes them both, there is no separation from it, only continuation. As the silence between them settled into something permanent, one final truth remained. Quiet, inevitable, and impossible to escape. He was supposed to break her, but in the end, she was the one who changed him forever